Hello everyone and welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris and the title of this session is The Alpha and Omega of Speaking, in which we will be sharing tips and tricks for setting up really successful speaking segments and speaking classes. My name is Neil Harris and like many of you, I am a teacher. I teach on a regular basis and as part of that, many of my students need and want to be able to develop their speaking skills. So what I'm sharing with you today is very much the ideas, the tips and the tricks that have worked for my learners as well as for me over the years. I'm going to begin by actually asking the question, what actually do we mean by a speaking activity? And then I'll talk in some detail about how we set up for success. Because for our students, the ability at the end of the lesson and that sense of accomplishment that they have completed a speaking activity successfully, that they've communicated, is highly motivating. And then in sections 3, 4, and 5, going to look at what happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end of that speaking segment or class. Whilst at the end, just thinking briefly about how we encourage our students to develop their speaking skills outside of the lesson, before, in the final section, conclusions, looking at wrapping everything up together. So let's start by looking at what actually do we mean by a speaking class or a speaking segment. And let me just clarify what I mean by those two terms. A speaking class for me is a lesson in which the main focus for the whole lesson is the development of students speaking, whereas a segment might be a part of a bigger lesson. And that will perhaps fit in as we start talking about the difference between form-focused target language speaking and meaning-focused communicative speaking. And with that in mind, I'd just like to share with you on this slide a presentation that I did for Gallery Teachers previously, where I made the point that teaching speaking is more than grammar practice. And I'm going to kind of extend on the views in that masterclass today. But don't worry if you haven't seen it. It is available in the Gallery Teachers Masterclass for Pro members, but I will not assume any of you having viewed it for you to be able to understand what we're looking at today. So here we are. We're in a classroom and context. We have a group of students who are all involved in speaking to one another. Now, of course, on the one hand, it just might be a friendly chat, but that doesn't really have any input, any learning involved with it. So let's assume that what's happening here in this image, you can see that it is created by AI. And in fact, as a kind of a giveaway to you, I used Adobe Firefly to create this image for free of a group of mixed nationality students talking to one another with some form of purpose. So let's move on to consider what some of those purposes might be in a speaking segment or in a speaking class. On this page, we can see in black two potential speaking activities, or so they seem. The first one is a review of the present perfect simple, and in the segment, the last 15 minutes of a 16-minute class, the students talk about their life experiences and share them with one another. But isn't this really a speaking vehicle of a grammar activation task? The focus here is on the student's ability to use the present perfect simple for a communicative outcome, talking about their life experiences. But for the teacher, and perhaps also for the students as well, the focus in feedback will be on the success at which they've mastered that grammatical structure. So for me, that's more grammar tested informally through speaking. The second activity is, I think, a little bit different. If you're familiar with speaking activities like the NASA survival simulation, students choose from a range of items which they think are going to be useful to enable them to survive on a distant planet. This was actually used by NASA themselves for training astronauts going to the moon. The end of the session, the teacher then gives the students feedback, what they did well, what they did less well in their grammar areas. Yes, the students have spoken, and yes, the activity has a clear communicative purpose, making decisions around what they're going to take with them to the moon and what they're going to leave behind. But the way in which the teacher has set this up, I think, limits the success of this as a speaking activity. Because as you can see, quote, the teacher helps the class reformulate grammar areas which the students found problematic. The teacher hasn't used this as an opportunity to practice some of the speaking sub-skills, functional language, language of agreement and disagreement, or the language of justifying opinions, and as such, I think, is a bit of a missed opportunity. On the next page, let's look at a third scenario and see how it's different. So in this situation, the students participate in a role play. One student takes the role of a climate change activist, and the other one is a climate change denier. They don't think that climate change is a big issue. And if you're interested in this topic, please look back in the Gallery Teachers catalogue to a previous excellent Gallery Teachers Masterclass on the topic of climate change education from Harry Waters. And this is the kind of topic that, having worked with Harry, I know that he uses in his classes. The purpose of the activity is for the learners to practice something that the teacher has helped them develop. That is the ability to use the language of persuasion, but also turn-taking based on the cultural norms that were agreed with the learners as being appropriate. This, for me, is clearly a speaking skills lesson. The students have had input on speaking sub-skills, and they're then given assessment for learning, formative assessment opportunity to try it out. The focus is not on language, it's on the success of their communication, and the feedback is aligned to this. This, for me, is what we mean by a speaking skills segment, or in this case, a speaking skills class. So if we perhaps disambiguate this further, you've heard me use the terms meaning-focused and form-focused. Don't worry if you're not familiar with the technical terms. What they mean, you will be familiar with. So in meaning-focused interactions, the students are communicating. They're involved in some kind of task, rather like the NASA survival game, but everything that happens in the lesson, really including the focus of the feedback, relates to the success of their communication, and in this case, the success of their oral communication. And feedback and feed forward can be explored through reformulation, clarification, and teacher support. That first scenario I shared with you, where the students were talking about their past experiences, and where for the teacher, she or he's looking to see, can the students use the present perfect, is very much a form-focused target language activation. The teacher has designed a lesson around a particular grammatical structure, here the present perfect, and then this is practiced with increasing stages of freedom for the students to say what they want to say. Perhaps previously they did gap fill or a sentence reordering activity, and now they're talking in a personalized way about their life experience. But for the teacher, this is all about checking whether they have successfully in the class been able to use the target structure. What they're saying is less important than whether they're saying it in the right grammatical way. Communication is not so important. And that, for me, is the distinction between the two. Now, both involve speaking, and both have their valid roles in a language classroom. It's just that I think that where we're talking about developing speaking, rather than grammar, our lesson setup, more of that later, and our feedback at the end should be aligned with the lesson and its speaking skills focus. And that's really, if you like, explained in more detail in this final slide of this section. The distinction between form-focused activation through oral output, and then meaning-focused interaction, the communicative urge to communicate meaning with other students through a task. So chances are you will be wanting to do some of both, some form-focused oral activation through output, and also some actual speaking sub-skills lessons leading to meaning-focused interaction. How do we set up both of these for success? That's what we're going to be looking at in the next section. I think most of all, we need to focus as the teacher designing the session on having absolute clarity of purpose. What is it that the lesson is setting out to be and to do? And that brings us back to those two types of lesson that I've mentioned previously. The meaning-focused interaction, where we're developing, practicing, using communicative activities for the students to improve their speaking with meaning-focused feedback at the end, or the target language lesson, where we are focused on a grammatical structure, a form, and then we give feedback on when the students did well using that form or where mistakes crept in our form-focused error correction. If we don't know which we're aiming for, then setting up the lesson is almost certainly going to become muddied. We'll end up with a lesson that doesn't probably achieve for us our learning objectives, and more importantly for our students, their learning outcomes. This slide comes back to previous gallery teachers' masterclasses. Everything connects in some kind of way. With previous sessions, there are two of them that look at the role of emergent language. And in emergent language, the key idea is that we are focused on meaning-focused interaction. And a really good way, not the only way, but a really good way to set up a lesson for meaning-focused interaction is through using task-based learning. And you can see the shape of a task-based learning lesson on the left-hand side of the screen, divided into the pre-task, where the students are introduced to the topic, where they go through a task cycle, they do a communicative task, they then plan to report back on how it went, and they then present that report before, with the teacher, analysing the language that was used or perhaps not used, and then the teacher giving input. And the ways that this can be done are listed in a number of the task types here at the bottom of the screen. If, on the other hand, you're going to do a form-focused lesson where you want the students to activate target language, you may well choose to use a PPP, presentation, practice, production lesson type. What's becoming clear is that if we don't know what our lesson is focusing on, be it language activation or speaking skills development, then we're not really going to be able to match the right lesson shape to that particular set of learning objectives and learning outcomes, which is why I'm sharing it with you here. PPP has its detractors. Task-based learning here on the left is becoming more and more aligned, I think, with research around second language acquisition and how really to help our learners to learn a language as successful as a way as possible. So if you haven't worked with, or if you haven't got experience of task-based learning, Google it, have a look at some of the resources that are out there, or perhaps take one of your PPP lessons and ask something like ChatGPT to restructure it as a task. I've done this and it worked quite well. But always have in mind what we're teaching, what our outcomes and objectives are, so that we can then, before the lesson, set it up for success by knowing how we're going to get from the beginning to the end of the lesson and the different stages in a task-based or in a PPP lesson that enable us to do that. So you will have heard me talk at some length about speaking subskills. So let's have a look at what some of them include. This isn't a complete inventory of speaking subskills, but it gives you, I think, a good flavour of what they involve. Yes, fluency and accuracy are there, but it's not the fluent and accurate use of a grammar structure. It's fluent and accurate language generally. It's about how students organise their speaking. It's about how they interact with one another, the amount of time or the overlap between speakers in some kind of communicative act. How do you start speaking? How do you reply to someone? How do you interrupt them in a culturally appropriate way? And also, if you've said something and it's gone wrong, what phrases can we use? Oh, let me rephrase that. Let me start again. What are repair strategies that our students can use to enable them to speak successfully and to communicate their ideas? All of these are sub-skills, and I argue and believe passionately that they need to be taught explicitly alongside the form-focused oral activation of target language if our students are going to be as good speakers as possible in English as their second or other language. There are other things to consider, and they're focused on screen now. So I'm just going to pause for a moment to give you time to read through the bullet points on screen, and then I'll have a look at them and explain to you any points that perhaps are not so clear. Much of this, as you will see, will relate to what we do before the class even takes place. Have we got a topic that respects and is relevant to student needs, wants, and interests? That's the third bullet point. If we're aiming at meaningful communication, have we asked them to do a task that is authentic in how it's set up? What task type have we chosen, and is it appropriate to the learner's needs, interests, but also their level going down? Does it offer students a degree of achievable challenge? And if we think they're going to struggle to get there, have we as teachers built in steps to enable them to get there? In other words, have we scaffolded the task? I'm now going to come up to the 2 points at the top. We've already talked about it being important that the teacher knows what it is the lesson is setting out to do, but also that we should share this with our learners. Much as I shared with you at the beginning of the session, the overview of what we're going to be looking at together, I always share in a clear statement with my learners at the beginning of the lesson what they will be able to do, hopefully better, by the end of the session. Shared learning outcomes. And often it's really helpful at the end of a speaking activity to get your students, as well as you, thinking about what went well and what didn't go so well. So to help to structure that, it's also a good idea to negotiate with the learners what your success criteria are. How will they know if they've been successful? Well, they need to have clear criteria agreed with them, I think, so that particularly younger learners or learners who are less familiar with assessment for learning, formative learning, that you actually help them to be able to reflect on their success. Okay, so sounds like there's a lot to do, and to an extent, yes, there is, but it's also important to remember that there are lots of things out there that can help us. So there's an idiom, a British idiom in here, using the word wheel. And the idea is that don't create new materials if good materials are commercially available and out there already. In other words, don't reinvent the wheel. And I'm going to show you some instances, some ideas of how we can set up for success, because there are many, many very gifted speaking class materials writers out there for whom we can save a lot of, thanks to whom we can save a lot of time by looking at what they've already produced. So over the years, now I've been teaching since the early 1990s. So some of these books probably reflect my age as a teacher. Gillian Porter Ladouce's book on role play, Christine Frank, Mario Rinvolucri, and Marga Bera. I hope that's a correct pronunciation. They're wonderful book, Challenge to Think. These are probably out of date, but you can find them secondhand on the internet. And these have wonderful, ready-to-go lessons, which you can look at, decide if appropriate, and use with your classes, or adapt. And this is the point. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're perhaps just making a few changes to make the wheel meet our students' needs exactly. More up-to-date books, of course, are available. This final one by Penny It's not the only book that she's written on discussions. This one is called Discussions and More by CUP. It's still in print. And there is, of course, her old classic, Discussions That Work, also now out of print, but still available on the internet. Then we have old classics. Sue Kay, published 30 years ago. I remember it. I used this book so much. It was called The Reward Intermediate Resource Pack. Now, this tends to focus primarily on the spoken activities for form-focused grammar activation activities. Virtually every activity is linked to a particular grammar structure. But that's fine, because our students do need grammar and accurate grammar and fluent grammar in order to communicate certain ideas. You just might want to layer in a communicative addition as well. I mentioned the book was 30 years old. Don't worry. Sue has just published an updated version late last year, the Reward Resource Pack. Just type into Google Reward Resource Pack. There's a good tongue twister for your students. Sue Kay, published by ELT, Teacher to Writer, and it's available from Amazon. You might be wondering what this image is for here. That is to make the point that course books have lots of speaking activities in them. And it may well be that don't just look at the course book that you're teaching for a particular class, but also look at other course books at similar levels for inspiration. You might choose to take something from a different course book just to give your students some variety. Of course, many teachers like to develop their own materials, and not just as grammar activation, but actual speaking activities. So some books that I found really useful are here on the left and in the middle, also from ELT Teacher to Writer, a book called How to Write Excellent ELT Materials, written, and the speaking activities section is written by Sarah Cunningham, who has then developed it in more detail in her specific How to Write Speaking Activities, again available from Amazon. So if you're interested in writing your own materials and you want to understand what it means to write the best possible speaking activities or how to adapt existing ones, that's a really good place to start. As is, of course, I hope, today's masterclass for you. Finally, the British Council run an entire course called How to Teach Speaking. The link to the workbook that goes with the course is available on the Gallery Teachers, the GT website, where you can actually find the link to that particular session. And I will be sharing the link with you in the live Q&A at the end of this video. So we've got ideas about where to get good speaking material from. What kind of things should we be teaching? Well, we've seen some of the speaking sub-skills. What about some of the activities, speaking activities that can be used to practice them? Here they are. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but in between discussions, interviews, surveys, A, B, pair work, information gaps, role plays, presentations, talks, and games, we've pretty much covered the majority of speaking activities. Now, as I was developing this page, it did occur to me that perhaps I hadn't used dialogues and dialogue builds. Don't worry, because dialogue builds are really important. I think they fit into the role play, but it's a role play probably between two or three people. Now, some people might say, well, which of these are appropriate for which levels? An information gap is actually at the heart of most of the speaking teaching that I do right now, where the level of my students needs to be C1, lower advanced or higher. And that might surprise you because an information gap, student A has some information, student B has different information, and they have to find out by talking to one another, is often associated with a low level learner, and rightly so. But it also works extremely well in the context of, for example, medical English, where the doctor is trying to find out the missing information that she or he doesn't have. What's wrong with the patient? How are they feeling? That is an information gap. Likewise, whilst a detailed discussion, as we're all going to have about speaking classes in the Q&A session, would be beyond an A1 level, if you grade your topic and you grade the expectations of what a discussion may be, I think simple, short discussions are possible even with A1 level learners. It's about adapting the materials to meet their needs. Because remember, particularly if you're teaching adults, what you don't want to do is infantilize them and involve them in tasks where they just feel like babies because of their level. They're not. They're highly intelligent, cognitively capable adults. And the activities we give them can be in tune with that profile, even though the student themselves may only have, like I do in Welsh, a low A1 level. Okay, so that's the section on setting up for success. Let's now move on and look at what we mean by the beginning, the middle, and the end, the alpha, the mu, and the omega of speaking classes, and what happens at each stage. In terms of the alpha, the beginning of the session, this presupposes that you've planned your lesson, you're clear on what it is you're doing, be it a meaning-focused interaction or a form-focused target language oral activation, and you're now ready for the class to run. Your material's in place, you're in the classroom. What happens now? Always remember the value of clear instructions and having an instruction check before the students do the activity. You might even demo it if you can, so the students can see it happening. Have a time frame, but also be flexible about that time frame. And remember, if you're having some kind of form-focused target language activation through speech at the end of the lesson, leave time for it. Often we find that the previous parts of the lesson overrun, and the students, the bit where they get to actually activate their language through their speech, is squeezed into 5 minutes where really they can't do anything. So always think about lesson stages and realistic timings, but also be flexible. If you've got a speaking activity and it's really going well and the students are still improving, you might extend it a little bit. Think also about handing over control to the students. So you might sit somewhere different from where you normally sit, probably normally at the front of the class. If you're asking the students to work in groups or have a class debate and you're there by the board, that may actually be a barrier to their communication. So take your chair, maybe sit at the back of the room where you can hear the students, but they can't see you, you can't see them, and they're therefore empowered to talk to one another without feeling that they need to be checking up and looking at how you're reacting to see if they're doing okay. I remember my very first experience of teaching when I was on an initial pre-service teaching program. I was praised by the observer for actually walking out of the room, because what was happening is the students were kept on looking at me. They kept on expecting me to give them input, to guide them. And I moved to the back of the room and still they used to turn around and look at me. So I actually walked out of the room. I crept back in again quite quickly because I wanted to hear what they were saying, but I was praised for recognizing that I needed to remove myself so that the students themselves could really get on with the business of speaking. So those are some tips for the beginning of the lesson. Now let's think about what's happening in the middle of the lesson or the segment at the point where the students are speaking. So this is the point where, as I've recommended in the alpha setup, you might be sitting away from the students, but able to listen to what they're saying. And you'll be making notes in order to give them some feedback. In the context of a form-focused target activation stage, you might be focusing on the language they're using. In a meaning-focused interaction, you'll be looking at the success with which they are implementing what they've been taught through input in terms of some of those speaking sub-skills, the turn taking, the repair strategies, and so on. Remember, when you're making notes, don't just jot down the things that they didn't do so well. Get good examples of what did go well and tell the students about them, re-elicit it from them in feedback and feed forward so that the students are aware of when things went well. It's motivating, and by drawing attention to it, it's more likely that they'll do it again in the future. I always say to my students before this kind of activity, I'm going to be writing notes. Don't worry about what I'm writing, and don't think because I'm writing you've done something wrong. I might be focusing on something you did I thought was really good. And that just tends to kind of reduce the stress. So they're thinking, oh, what's Neil written? What did I say? What was wrong about it? Because often students tend to associate notes with things that went wrong. Other things you can do is take some post-it notes, those little yellow stickers, and pass them around. Now, of course, at this stage, you're more visible, but it can have positive impact. For example, if you've got a student who's dominating, you might actually send them a post-it note or hand one to them carefully, not too obviously, saying, ask someone else a question, because that encourages another learner to participate and it stops that first student from giving their opinion. Likewise, a student who is very reluctant to participate, you might pass them a post-it note saying, it's okay, use this phrase to interrupt someone. You could maybe name the person they're going to interrupt and tell that other person in a post-it note to expect an interruption from that learner. It can also be used for praise. That was really good. Good repair strategy. Well done. Or if there is something that is beginning to have a negative impact on the communication, a word that keeps getting mispronounced, you might feed that into the learner on a post-it note without interrupting the communication, just to put them right, perhaps with an IPA transcription of how the word should be said. What about the end, the omega? Well, as I've said all along, be guided by your lesson type. Is it meaning focused or is it form focused target language? and therefore match what you do in feedback to that way in which the lesson has been set up. Target language form focused, you'll probably be focusing primarily on language success and on language repair. Whereas if it's meaning focused, you may want to focus on how successful the students were and why, and also show them examples of where things went very well, and to look at how you could improve where things went less well. That's that final stage in a task-based learning context. But be selective. You can't focus on everything. So you can't feedback on everything. So you might limit your feedback to just the area that the lesson was looking at. You might add a little bit of extra work, perhaps on pronunciation or any areas which need urgent repair. But, death by feedback is a good way of switching your students off. So be selective, but also consider, when are you going to give feedback? Is it going to be at the end of the lesson, or is it going to be in a lesson where you see them next time? Both have their advantages and their disadvantages. Make principled decisions about what will work for the learners based on the lesson that you do. But remember, please, 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 wherever possible, focus on the success as well as the developmental areas. I'm going to start looking at this in a little bit more detail as we come towards the end of the session now. So in the context of meaning-focused interactions, where the students are communicating a task, then what do we do in feedback? Here we are on screen. Focus at some point, probably at the very beginning, on the overall success of the communicative tasks. Did the students complete the task? So in the context of the NASA survival game, did they come up with a list of items that they had selected with good reasons? And perhaps this can be compared with the official list that was given to the astronauts in their training. And this appears in a lot of course books and speaking class materials, or you can Google it. But also get the students involved actively in the feedback through reflection. Ask them, were they successful? That's why I've suggested in the setup, you need to agree the success criteria with them before they do the activity. Get them to answer two simple questions. Well, what enabled communication? And when was communication less successful, or where did it not take place? And why? What were the inhibitors? But also make sure that in the feedback that they're giving each other, and perhaps you're giving as well, that you do focus explicitly on whatever speaking subskill you set up for, be it turn-taking, reaching agreement, justifying, or whatever. In terms of form-focused language activation, working with target language, then we're going to be looking at the success of their use of the target structure I set up at the beginning of this masterclass, looking at the idea of a survey in class where the students shared information about their past experiences. Have you ever ridden a motorbike? Have you ever smoked a cigarette? Obviously, the questions will depend on the student's age and so on. So here, it is important to remember the difference between an error and a mistake. If you have a form focus, the present perfect for life experience, the students therefore should be at the point where they are beginning to be able to self-correct. Some will be better at it than others. So this might be seen as a mistake. They know the grammar, they know the form, it just didn't come out right in real-time interaction. Self-correction is therefore possible. But if you're working with a group of students who have never seen a given form, they've not been taught it, don't, think about how realistic is it to ask the students in groups to self-correct. Maybe only the top 1 or 2 students in the class who are fast finishers and know a bit more English may know the point. So we need to consider how we correct based on whether the incorrect use of the language derived from an error, developmental problem, or a mistake, a slip. We can also consider error in terms of being local or global, and this can help us to really focus more clearly on what we give feedback on. So if we look at an example from students talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of deep sea exploration, should this be something that money is given to in research? Probably a B2, C1 level conversation, discussion. A local error is one which is unlikely to cause issues with understanding. There's an incorrect use of the definite article here. Exploration is a uncountable noun, and therefore we've got a minor mistake here. It's local, it's unlikely to cause issues of understanding, and also it can be treated. We can probably talk about countable, uncountable nouns and the articles we use with them. But if we get something like this, deep sea exploration refused our understanding of green life. Here, this is an error that gets in the way of communication. Communication fails as a result. So in this context, we might decide that we're going to treat it because it blocks communication, but we also might realize that we as the teacher are going to have to reformulate this because it may be something that the students are not able to deal with themselves. It could be a false friend. Also, we've got the distinction between treatable and untreatable. Treatable is where we're able to give easy explanations, often because of a rule. Underwater animals has importance for the ecosystem. Singular, plural, concord level, concord, type mistake. Write it up on the board. Ask the students, can you find the mistake? Can you correct it? Hopefully they underline has and they change it to have. It's treatable. Whereas the untreatable one, deep sea exploration involves significant risk, including the missing of life. Now, I think we probably can understand what's meant here. The loss of life, people dying. But there's no easy rule to explain this. So we can't just say, what's the rule here? And the student says, So it's a collocation issue. And it may be a collocation that the students aren't even familiar with. So for them, it becomes untreatable. What's emerging, therefore, in all of this is that we have to think carefully. We need a principle. We need a rationale for how we give feedback. We're very near the end now, but I just wanted very briefly, we can pick up on this more in the Q&A session on what happens in terms of developing speaking outside of the classroom. And I've tried to kind of capture a number of the contexts for those of you participating today and listening to this recording later. It might be that you teach in an English L1 context, America, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Ireland. In which case, getting the students using their English with their homestays, if they're staying with local families, or out there in the streets of where they're living, is a really good kind of homework and self-study. If, on the other hand, as will probably be true for the majority of you, your students are living in countries where English is not an official language at all, then we can make use of apps and programs that became really popular during the lockdown, but still have their place in terms of developing speaking. So, for example, students can record themselves speaking using Flip, previously known as Flipgrid, or they can send messages to one another, voice messages through WhatsApp. You might provide them with a task, find a picture of a friend and describe them. The only thing I would say if you're going to do that is do consider the implications of safeguarding. Make sure that you have permission for the students to share their phone number with each other and also with you. I do this, but I don't give my students my own phone. I have a specific phone number paid for by my school to do this. But whether you're in an L1 or an L2 context, finding an English language speaking buddy, again, age permitting, is really useful. And many of you say, but I don't have any connections in those L1 speaking countries. Worry not. This is where AI, I think, is going to be a major game changer for language learners and language teaching, because I'm experimenting right now with using ChatGPT as a language coach, but also as a dialogue buddy, using voice enhanced ChatGPT on my mobile phone. So to conclude, plan for success. Know what you're aiming to set out to do in a speaking segment or class, and develop it so that your learning objectives and your learning outcomes match your activities, and that your feedback are all matched together. Be clear, are you focusing on language feedback, a form-focused oral activation, or is this a communicative task with a meaning-focused interaction? Your speaking lessons should be, I would suggest, in your speaking segments, an element of both, not just the target language, form-focused speaking activity, but actually developing the speaking skill itself. And make sure, therefore, if you're involved in a meaning-focused interaction, that your feedback focuses on that sub-skill rather than yet more random grammar comments and what went well, what was good, what wasn't so good. Focus on the sub-skill. Finally, always remember to praise good performance. With all of that in mind, here is some suggested resources which I've used in developing this particular masterclass. They're also available on the Gallery Teachers website, on the GT website. And finally, just to remind you, you've seen in the masterclass today some examples of previous masterclasses, one on speaking and grammar, how they're different, delivered by me, others on emergent language. The Gallery Teachers Masterclass Pro membership gives you a massive archive of really top-notch speakers sharing with you their expertise, but also the ideas that come in from teacher colleagues in the Q&A session at the end. You've also got the benefits of unlimited access to those workshops, free annual safeguarding, and I talked about safeguarding in the context of WhatsApp groups for speaking activities in class. There's a TEFL refresher course and downloadable PDFs. I've signed up. I really benefit from this, and I encourage you to consider it as well. Thank you all, and I look forward to now extending the discussion in Q&A. Thank you very much.